thank you, Linda and Kirsten, and to all the speakers earlier on, and to Margaret, Eamon and Moira for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I'm not sure, were many of you here for Declan McGonigal's earlier fantastic presentation? I have to acknowledge actually the presence of a couple of people here, representatives from Dublin City Council and from Fáilte Ireland, both organisations that were instrumental in the establishment of the museum that I work in, and my director Trevor White, who's hiding down the back, and I hope he won't mind that I stole this from our collection just to show you. Declan finished with a photograph of this exact cottage, which is in our collection. You can come and visit it anytime you want. Such was the ubiquity of that image that cottage became mass-produced, sold all over the world, was visited by Grace Kelly. And we have this in the museum, and I suppose this will give you a sense of the flavour of the museum. Our version of the cottage has a little question on it which says, what was the average house price in Dublin in 1996? Anyone got an answer? €83,071. So I work in the Little Museum, which is a small civic museum just across the road on the green, just on the other side of the green. We're a very public-facing museum whose collection was completed through public donation, and the principal mission of the museum, as Moira mentioned earlier on, is the cultivation of civic pride, which isn't something that's necessarily very easy to quantify. I come from a number of backgrounds. I'm a composer and a designer by training, so my presentation is going to be peppered with a lot of musical references. I apologise in advance. I misspent much of my youth playing in punk rock bands. Ended up working in public history by accident, but I found that, interestingly, at this point in my life, a lot of the ideas that influenced me in terms of music, society, and politics are starting to find a common ground in the museum that I work in. So to, I suppose, parse that out a little bit, I'm going to base this presentation around a number of rude words. Not the kind of words that I would have sang when I was in that punk band. Other rude words. Just so they don't offend you, I'd suggest that you drop your preconceptions momentarily for the next 15 minutes. Drop your prudishness. Try not to be too shocked. The very first rude word is populism. And in our museum we have a little maxim. It's a little museum, so we have little maxims. The main maxim that we use is be popular but not populist. Now, for a lot of people, those two words mean the same things, but there are slight distinctions. And if you believe that they mean the same thing, I think you're doing that at your peril. I'll start talking about this with some questions that I like to ask friends of mine that kind of wind them up a little bit. If you ask some of these questions, they're quite obvious questions to me. If you ask them at a dinner party with artists present, you're likely to get into a bit of trouble. The first question is, do you want an audience for your work? The second question is, who is that audience? And the third question, how big is that audience? So is that audience just your friends? Is it just your artistic peers? Is it just the reviewer from O32C magazine in Berlin? Who is the audience that you're looking for? To me, it seems logical that if you want to make work for public consumption, that the public is your audience. Now, I didn't have time after Declan's presentation to run over to the museum and change the word public to the word social. I would have liked to have been able to do that. But this is a concept that, from my own work in the arts and the museum, I think this is a concept that is bizarrely lost on a huge amount of people. Now, to kind of have a think about who the public actually is, we have to do it all the time in the museum, and we do it through a relatively crude tool known as visitor analysis. So to kind of talk about visitor analysis for a second, let's say I turn around to my director and say, Trevor, we really need to get more families into the museum on a Saturday. Now, there's a strategy for that where we want to encourage intergenerational visits. There's like a civic reason for doing that. And this is the bit where if you were a professional for-profit business, you would hire some kind of really boring guy to come in and do an analysis of what's called the customer journey. So they'd figure out who it is, who is that family, what is it that's going to make them find out about your museum, what are they going to want to experience in your museum. Now, we don't have to pay anyone to do that. We can spend 2 minutes thinking about it, or even just thinking about ourselves. And if I were to say, okay, what is the typical father who I want to attract? I want him to bring his kids into the museum on a Saturday, give his wife a break. And if I think about him for a couple of minutes, I'll end up with something like this. You can't really see it. This is not really the typical father from Dublin. The typical father from Dublin is in his early to mid-40s. He feels guilty about spending too much time on his smartphone and his computer. He'll be mostly happy if his kids have a great time on Saturday doing whatever. He'll be extremely happy if he gets to be actively involved in that whatever. He probably watched a free downloaded episode of Game of Thrones on Friday night, whilst getting a bit hammered, so he has a hangover, ergo a kind of a low-level existential crisis going on. And he can easily alleviate that crisis in its entirety by being a consumer in the most basic, bland way available to him. So in short, we want to attract customers who are happy to avoid digital interaction. They're mostly focused on their kids' enjoyment. They're keen to be active in that. They're used to paying and not paying for cultural experience. They can achieve everything that they need to on a Saturday by buying a jumper for the kids in pennies, going into McDonald's, and then bringing the kids to the playground. And that is who we're in competition with. We're in competition with pennies and McDonald's. And if we want to take their customers away from them and bring them in here, we need to start speaking their customers' language. And in the end, our customers will be really glad that they came into our museums and our galleries rather than going into the default experience that our father I'm talking about reverts to most Saturdays. It was an analysis of one father, by the way. The second rude word is emotion. Many of you will be familiar with the great filmmaker, the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, who said that we think art demands special knowledge, we demand some higher meaning from an author, but the work must act directly on our hearts or it has no meaning at all. Now, in our museum, we deal directly with a phenomenon known as nostalgia. Visitors come into the museum, most of them are local, they're often with their grandchildren or their children, and we have a focus on material culture, like this kind of thing, and a kind of a chaotic egalitarianism, which we try to use to deliver history and memory back into the hands of local visitors, and we actively encourage conversations on tours between locals and between international visitors. And this is really interesting. It works. A strange camaraderie occurs when a bunch of local retirees are asked to describe Charlie Haughey to a large number of visiting Italian people, and they collectively turn out with the description of the Irish Berlusconi. We often find visitors in tears in the museum. Often they found references within the collection to their deceased parents. They found references to the places that they grew up, sometimes the exact addresses of where they grew up as children. So it's not just nostalgia that's going on. The museum is acknowledging their past as visitors, and it's acknowledging their childhoods. And nostalgia is, I think, it's sometimes considered a cheap emotion, or at least something that's not really the same as proper, grown-up, historically accurate recollection, as if such a thing exists. Nostalgia, I think, is in fact is one of the most powerful emotional conductors that exists, and it's kind of a spark plug for intergenerational communication. And I'm going to give you an example of how this works. So imagine. How many of you are parents? Hands up. How many are parents? Okay, so imagine you're sitting, you have a young child, you've been having real trouble with your kid, and you're sitting down with your father, and your father doesn't really talk to you very much about anything. and you're trying to get advice on what to do with this situation with your kid, and your father isn't really saying anything, and then you turn around and you say, what did you do in that situation when you were my age? And that's an amazing thing will start happening then, because you're immediately creating this shared social, emotional experience, and the conversation will begin, and it is the easiest way to break down any communication barrier that you have with your parents, is to simply get them to empathize with your situation through really easy questions like that. And by us asking our visitors about their experiences within the walls of our museum and involving them in conversation about the answers in a shared social space, which is really important, we do something I think that's much more important than simply teaching about history. Now, the final rude word that I wanted to talk about is accessibility. Theodore Adorno, have we any music graduates or people who had the misfortune of having to study Theodore Adorno? Theodore Adorno was one of the great philosophers of music and is a champion grump, and he maintained that accessibility deprives music of social truth. Ergo, popular music lacks any genuinely progressive social role. Now, I think this is worth having a think about in the context of the work that we do in museums and galleries. Did Mozart make bad art because we can remember his tunes? I wonder when Kanye West is sampling Nina Simone songs about lynchings, he's not really talking about social history, sure he isn't. No, of course he's talking about social history. We just distrust it because he manages to package it up in such a way that he can parcel it and sell it to millions of people. But those millions of people are then listening to samples of Nina Simone singing about lynching. I think, to tie into something that Declan was saying earlier on, I think one of the great victories, and I suppose in a way one of the great failures of modernism, was the rise of iconoclasm as a requirement of true art, so that shock of the new. And I think this philosophy has allowed a lot of artists and practitioners to silo themselves away from the public and to make work that's increasingly dependent on what the Turner Prize winner Grayson Perry referred to as international art English. Language that restricts art, I think, from conducting meaningful social discourse. And most of us who are curators today, who are working in institutions today, we're children of modernism. We grew up with modernist teachers, and we had modernist mentors, and it's very, very easy for us to casually perpetuate this kind of idea unless we check ourselves. And I think that produces cultural offerings that value academic authority over social connection, experiences and institutions that are suspicious of popularity, and organisations that suspect that accessibility is a kind of a deal with the devil, that it's like a thin end of the wedge that's ultimately going to result in some kind of watered down cultural product. And while all of this is happening, Beyonce is on stage in the middle of the Super Bowl, and whether she's doing it adequately or not, she's engaging with black militant history to an audience of millions of white Americans in a country that's still riddled with racial issues. There's no real high or low culture. To paraphrase Tarkovsky again, there are only two forms of art, good and mediocre. And I'd add to that another two forms, effective and ineffective. Now, our audiences, our teenagers, they're getting cultural product that's relevant on their iPhones, sitting at home, and what are we going to do about that? What are we going to offer them? I think one of the keys to this is to go back and look at Mozart and Kanye West again, those two examples. So what they both had in common, right? Aside from megalomania, we don't have to experience Mozart on Twitter. I'm sure he was probably way worse than Kanye West is. But both of them made, and West makes music that challenges the orthodoxy at every opportunity that they have, but they both succeeded in shaping a lot of the music that came after them. Both of them are avant-gardists. But they also have something else that's really in common that's very important for us to consider in terms of public spaces. They both use, in what we call in design terms, entry points, I suppose, to smuggle big ideas into the minds of their audiences. And this happens in publishing, right, where we design pages in such a way that we keep the reader on the page all the time. So how do we keep them on the page? In music, how do we keep the listener listening? And in museums and galleries, how do we keep them in the museum? How do we make them stay longer? How do we make them explore more? So for Mozart, entry points, they took two forms, really. He composed within very conventional formats, like string quartets, piano sonatas, all these kinds of things. And then he also placed an emphasis, and this was where he kind of broke ground. He also placed an emphasis on these things. Does anyone know what that is? Can anyone hum that? There it is. Yeah, well done. That's it's the opening motif of his 40th symphony, 40 symphonies. Jesus. And sorry. Oh well, I don't have perfect pitch. I can't tell. It sounded great to me. This is a melody, and there's another contemporary term for melodies, which is a hook. And I think a hook is actually a really good. It's a better term for them. Mozart used these as Trojan horses to basically to steal ideas into listeners. He was clever enough to know that if he could engage his listeners at a very top level with what he was doing, that he could bring them into worlds that they had never experienced before in music, into worlds that were very, very avant-garde and very, very subversive as well. And I think similarly, when the Bowles Kanye is cutting up old gospel songs and soul songs, and he's making these kind of, these songs that kind of top the charts and are sung all around the world, he's using nostalgia. And he's using melody, and he's using cultural history in a way to bring what are then actually really avant-garde musical ideas into popular consciousness. And we're naive, I think, if we believe that our audiences can't handle sophisticated concepts. Remember that today we're dealing with audiences, to go back to our dad who downloaded the free torrent of Game of Thrones, we're dealing with audiences who can handle these like huge, broad narratives that put war and peace in the halfpenny place, and they binge watch them. So I think we believe at our peril that our audiences can't handle sophisticated concepts. I think it's simply a matter of how we present these concepts to them. And if we want the public to come in and experience our buildings and our collections, the doors have to be open. We can't present them with a show that defies their understanding, that's wrapped up in language that's so convoluted that not even the museum staff can understand it. If we keep doing that, I think people will continue to sit at home and find solace in looking at pictures of cats on the internet. And our institutions will only be able to solve the problem by having blockbuster show after blockbuster show that just feeds the kind of Instagram spectacle culture of society today, which, in other words, is a never-ending series of Jeff Koons retrospectives. Now, in conclusion, I think the bigger and more diverse the audience, the more challenging the problem is. And as public institutions, we're often trying to appeal to the widest and most diverse audiences imaginable, which is difficult, so it's not surprising that we fail, but I don't think it's impossible. This is a small, just one small panel from an exhibition that we have on in the museum at the moment, which is our 1916 Easter Rising commemorative exhibition, centenary exhibition, and we commissioned a local artist, an amazing artist named Fergal McCarthy, to create an exhibition of drawings on the Rising that would be accessible to children, in the knowledge that it would ergo be extremely accessible to most adults as well. We haven't gotten, amazingly, any flack for it. It's a completely irreverent exhibition. It's really historically accurate. He spent 8 months doing untold research. Not to go into too much of the kind of the detail about it, but he limited himself to the amount of words he could use in one slide. He personalised all the characters. He phoned me up halfway through his research and said, "I can't find a way to not use the phrase penal laws," and because he knew that historical terminology and dates were a turn-off and would make people stop reading. Now, all of the kind of magical research that he did is wrapped up in tiny details in these drawings. So if you're an academic, you can go in and you have all of these levels of detail available to you. But the most important thing is that the first level of detail is available to everyone. And the public love it. It's a really successful exhibition, and we've published a book of it, and it's selling all over the place now. Just to finish off, I read this presentation out to my Director of Development yesterday evening, and I thought her comment was interesting. She said, "I didn't like all of your waffly academic stuff. It was the stuff about the public that mattered." Thank you.